Greetings everyone, this is Ahav Ever from the Chronicles of Ahav Ever, and today's video is going to be about how Torah scrolls were transcribed according to Torath Mosheh. So first thing is the question of how does it all start? Now you've seen in other videos where I've talked about Torah scrolls and what they basically mean, and essentially I think the best way to translate this idea into English would be to call a Sefer Torah an official Torah scroll, meaning that there's a particular mitzvah from the Torah that every Jewish man is required to transcribe for himself or have available for himself his own Torah scroll. Now, there's two paths that a person can go about doing this. One path is, for example, where someone says something that's going to be officially used in front of a community, a Jewish community, has a higher, strict level of requirements involved in it. So that path particularly takes about a year to produce. Now, the other path is where someone says, okay, I just need something quick, and I'm going to basically transcribe it so that I have it available, which also requires a high level of accuracy, but just not on the same level as an official Torah scroll does. And in this video, I'm going to be specifically talking about the process of producing an official Torah scroll that can be read in a Jewish public setting, so for example, in a synagogue during the reading of the Torah. Now, the best way to look at this, and I've mentioned this in previous videos, is the particular historical aspect of it, is that when Moshe ben Amram, also known as Moses or Moshe Rabbeinu to Torath Mosheh Jews and Orthodox Jews, when he originally, before he passed away, transcribed the Torah, meaning that he was given by Hashem, the creator of all things, the exact text, including the type of words to use, the spacing, meaning that he himself was not allowed to input anything into the text himself, that essentially he was having the information dictated to him by the creator of all things and the method that the creator used in terms of what's called nevuah. And essentially what happened was that what Moshe Rabbeinu did was essentially take the text he was given to it, transcribe it, and then from there he made 13 copies that was given to the leaders of each of the 12 tribes, with a master copy that was kept in the Mishkan, also known as the Tabernacle, and also when the temple was built in Jerusalem, that master copy was kept in that particular Bet HaMikdash, as we call that in Hebrew. And essentially what that would mean is that all Torah texts they essentially have to point back to a common ancestor text, if you will. So it means that no matter where in the Jewish world you go, or went before the state of Israel, whether it be in the Middle East, whether it be in Africa, whether it be in Asia, whether it be in Europe, wherever, all texts would supposedly, you would think, point back to a common text. And essentially, if the text is accurate in any location, they would all have similarities. So in order to understand this concept, first of all, a person who's not initiated into this mindset, into this culture, would first have to understand, well, what is a Torah scroll? What does it even mean to say something's a Torah scroll? And essentially in Hebrew, we call it a Sefer Torah. And a Sefer Torah consists of several parts, which is Bereshith, and in English people usually call that Genesis, Shemoth, which people usually in English would call that the Exodus, Vayigro, which is often called Leviticus in English, Midbar. The Midbar is usually called Numbers in English, and Dvorim, which is known as Deuteronomy. Now, these sections of scrolls, if you will, when transcribed and when checked and reviewed and everything, are put together into one text, and that makes up a Sefer Torah. And this Sefer Torah is read in all Torah-based Jewish communities on a number of occasions during the week, meaning that, for example, on the second day of the week, which in the Jewish calendar, comparing it to the American calendar, would be on Mondays, also on Thursdays, and then also on the Shabbat, on the Sabbath. Those are the 3 days out of the week, the normal regular week that the Torah is read from. And a portion of the Torah is read during this time of the week, with a full portion that's read on the Shabbat, on the Sabbath. And then from there, shorter portions are read during Monday and Tuesday, the beginning part of that portion. And when this is done, essentially everybody in the synagogue is actually reading along with either the person who's reading it. In some communities, they have one person who's designated as the reader for everybody, and everyone who goes and does a certain blessing and then goes from there. But in communities like my own, in the Yemenite community, everyone reads for themselves. Essentially, everyone's taught from the time that they're kids how to read a Torah, And if you go back and look at the video I did about the Masoretic text, it explains why that has some meaning to it. But essentially, from that point, it's like saying that the text is proofread and proof checked at least 3 times a week. And that's a process that's been going on for the last several thousand years from the time the Torah was given until the current era. So then as begs the question of, in terms of, okay, producing a Torah scroll, what is the process from start to finish? So essentially, to begin with, in order to produce a Torah scroll, a Sefer Torah, you have to first start with the skin of a kosher animal. Now, there's 2 processes that are basically the only 2 processes approved for it, and one of them is called Javil, and also the other one is called Klaf. Now, Galaf is used in a number of Jewish communities in terms of Northern European Jewish communities and certain Middle Eastern Jewish communities, but the highest standard is Gawil. Now, the thing about Gawil is that this is the same method that was, according to Jewish texts and Jewish history, was used during the time of Moshe ben Amram. And that Moshe Rabbeinu, when he wrote the Torah scrolls that he wrote them on Gawil. Now, this particular graphic actually shows some of the different types of animals that can be used to make Jawil. And essentially, what it basically ends up is that the hide is processed, almost like it's like if you're making leather. I think that's probably the best way to look at it. And essentially, from there, once the skin is like basically removed, cleaned, processed, and then from there, and also formed in a way that it can be used. In a Torah scroll, which would basically make it have to be rectangular in a sense. From there, the process can really begin. Now, what has to be known here is that the process of writing a Torah scroll is not just anybody who comes off the street, sits down and writes a Torah scroll. The Torah scroll, first of all, has to be written by someone who is a Jew, who keeps Torah and who's known to keep Torah. It has to be someone who has a history of studying all the laws that come about, and also all the halachot that are encompassed upon writing a Torah scroll, and they have to be experts in it. Not only do they have to be experts in it, they have to go back and recheck recheck again all of the work that they've done, which would mean that they have to take a known kosher Torah text, Torah scroll, and use that as the basis for checking their work. And that work is, of course, checked by them, and also nowadays it's checked by computer to make sure that the accuracy is there. And it goes without saying that, again, like I said before, when these are read in like synagogues, like pretty much, 3 times a week during a regular week, and then also when you have Jewish Chagim, Jewish holidays come up, it's read from also again. It's basically like saying that every year the person's work is being checked over and over again. And one of the rules that exist about dealing with the Torah scroll, besides the fact that the person doing it has to be someone who's known to keep the Torah and known, for example, to keep it correctly. So let's say, for example, you have someone who says they want to write, copy a Torah scroll, because you don't write it, you copy it. One of the rules is that they can't copy it from memory. They can't sit down and say, okay, I know this word by memory. Every single letter, every single word has to be, copied from a master text that preceded it. Many of those master texts are several hundred years old themselves. And the other thing is the person has to do a lot of practice, writing before they can even go into the process of writing that Torah scroll for that day. So, essentially it takes about a year to go through and write a Torah scroll from start to finish. And that's, of course, after the processing we mentioned, even the ink itself has to be a very specific ink that's made specifically for writing Torah scrolls. It's not an ink that can be just bought in the store. It's something that's specifically made. And a number of soferim, people who write, transcribe Sefer Torahs, there's a number of them that actually make it themselves. The Jewish text in terms of halacha defines like what the actual ink is made of. And it's basically a brew that has to be made up, prior. And there's a number of people who actually buy it, but again, it's like very specific to the job. So then to understand, okay, as I mentioned before, the process of actually writing a Sefer Torah from a known like text, for example, the same process is also used for writing what's called Megillat Esther. So essentially what happens is that once the person who's the sofer has done all the checks and balances, if you will, that he's supposed to do beforehand to do it, which means he usually would have to go to a mikvah, which means that he would have to do like tefillah before he does a prayer. He would have to pray before he does it. He would also have to do practicing. And then from there, once he's done all the checks and balances that are according to Jewish law and which are common amongst all ancient Jewish communities up to the present, meaning it doesn't matter if it's an Ashkenazi Jew, a Yemenite Jew, a Sephardic Jew, a Mizrahi Jew, everyone who holds by Torath Mosheh has the same rules about how they prepare and actually what they're doing. So essentially from there, they're able to go through and basically copy the text as it is from a previous text that they have in front of them and are using as the basis. And again, they're not allowed to be able to go through and say, okay, I remember this letter was this or this word was this. It all has to be done based upon a prior text that's in front of them during the transcribing process. So as I mentioned before, this process normally takes about a year to complete from start to finish. And anytime mistakes are made, there are certain types of mistakes that can be corrected on the spot. But there's certain types of mistake that will require the sofer to basically take the text he was working on and basically put it away and not allow it to be used in an official setting. Those kind of texts, for example, as I mentioned in a previous video, could be called a chumash. So a person could, let's say, purchase that text, have the text maybe corrected enough for them, but it can't be used in an official setting in a synagogue in front of people. And anytime that a person is reading from a Torah in a synagogue and they notice a certain mistake, the whole congregation has to immediately stop right where it is. That text has to be verified. And in many communities, if a child comes up and also can't read it or notices the mistake, then the text has to be rolled back up and put away. And it has to be corrected as soon as possible if it can be, and if not, it has to be taken out of circulation and another scroll used in its place. So again, the process of transcribing a Torah is very painstaking, which means that not every Jewish person is going to be out there, writing an official Torah scroll. It means that the men who are doing this essentially are men who have trained in it from a number of years and who've learned it and who are very meticulous, meaning that if a person doesn't have a lot of patience, they're not going to be a sofer for a Sefer Torah. Because again, if this is something that you're doing for a year, out of your life, and this is your livelihood for a year, essentially the amount of time and energy that goes into it is not something that most people would normally do. And in fact, if someone considers all this to be nonsense, then you can essentially say that this is not the kind of person that's going to be writing a Sefer Torah. It would not do well in terms of doing Torath Mosheh, because again, the checks and balances around the sofer is not just the fact that someone takes it and says, okay, he wrote it, it must be right. It's that he's being constantly checked and balanced by the fact that he has to go through and check it after he's done it several times. It's also checked by computer nowadays. And then from there, it's also checked, by other people who read through the whole thing from start to finish. And then when it's sent into a community, people who read the Torah scroll, from start to finish, will be reading it year after year after year after year for the rest of their lives. So if you will, in one generation, you could easily have a Torah scroll that, let's say, was read from at least 90 times, start to finish through a 90-year period. And from there, essentially, if mistakes are made in it, then it can be checked. And essentially, that's a continuous process, because the accuracy is something that everyone's looking for. And essentially, if someone who doesn't know certain Jewish communities, there are certain communities where they're looking for people to say, okay, let me see if this person had a mistake here. And this is something that's an important part of the process. So again, what the important element is that a sofer is not just simply writing the text from start to finish and just simply going through and just writing what they think, or writing what's there. Essentially, the entire text has different levels of writing involved in it, meaning that there are certain words that have letters that are a little bit longer than others. There are certain parts of the text that have spaces in them that are required to be there. There's a certain format that's required to be there, and this is the format that has even been found in ancient texts from more than 1,000 years ago. And you can tell the difference between a text that is done by a sofer for the use of an official use in a synagogue versus a text that is not, because generally speaking, if it's a text that's used in an official setting, it's going to have the spacings and it's going to be set up in a certain, more formatted and uniform way, where a text that's just used for personal use, doesn't have to follow those rules. So one of the things that some people don't know is a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls were not official text to be used in a synagogue setting. A lot of them were personalized text. You can tell by the way that they're written, and also by the way that they don't follow a certain format. But even with that, as we'll see later in this video, they're still the same text, essentially. So the next step of this process is that once the Torah scroll is completed, meaning that once the person has actually written the different text, Because of the fact that animal skin is used, like if you will, like it's almost like made into leather for certain type of text, or almost like a type of parchment made from animal skin. It's not like a Torah scroll is essentially a continuous like parchment or leather piece, from start to finish, but that it's basically sewn together using sinew from an animal that essentially is used to connect the different sections together. Now, the interesting thing is in this video you see here, the sofer who was actually putting this together, the whole time when he's speaking, what he's actually saying are different like words of Torah. So he's essentially going over, verbally that his work is very important, and it's what he's saying as kedusha, as kodesh, and that the importance of the text is very important. And he's going through and mentioning certain halachot, certain Jewish laws about the text, and certain things about the text. He's continuously going over this while he's sewing this together. And essentially, he's using like really, if you will, low-grade tools to do this, because these are the same kind of tools that were being used several thousand years ago to put the text together. And the process is still the same, So essentially, one of the things that's interesting is the type of the Torah text that I've seen. You see a lot in my videos. It's called Javil. And essentially, the Dead Sea Scrolls are made with the same kind of processing, the same kind of material. And Jabil also often lasts like at least about 1,000 years if it's made in the correct way. And you find that with like also a lot of older texts, Jewish texts that are found in different parts of the Middle East, for example, that the ones that were used in the parts of the Gavil or essentially last like several thousand years, if not 2,000 years in some cases. And a lot of the texts that you find in museums are like made in the same process, which is still used today. So these are examples of Jabil Torah scrolls. And essentially these particular scrolls, just looking at them, I can tell they're about several hundred years old. As I've mentioned several times in my videos, in my community, we have a Torah scroll that's about 200 years old that was brought from Yemen by the rabbi who passed away a number of years ago in the community. And this, for example, is a picture of a Torah scroll that was brought from Yemen just recently, within the last few years, by a Jewish family who the Jewish agency helped get out of Yemen. And this particular Torah scroll is around 800 years old. The man who brought it with his family wouldn't let go of it the whole time. And essentially, it's been passed down from like grandfather to son, grandson to son to like his son, and so on and so on for the last 800 years. The Torah scroll can't be used officially because it's just old. It's so old that there are certain types of corrections that had to be made to it in terms of making sure certain words that faded out were like recopied again, and it's been in circulation for so long that at this point it's what's called pasul, meaning that it's a family heirloom, it's something that stays in their family and they use it and study from it, but it's not something that would be officially used in a synagogue. It's almost like saying this is a historical piece. If his family were to, put it in a museum, that's understandable, but it's something that stays in their family. It's going to be passed on to his son, and so on until, basically the time where it can't be passed on anymore. So this is one of the checks and balances also when you have someone who shows up from a country that has had no contact with other Jewish communities, for the most part. And, they show up with an 800-year Torah scroll that's compared to like Torah scrolls made within the last few hundred years and they're the same. That's a part of the checks and balances. Now, a person may say, well, how do you know that all Torah scrolls are the same? Essentially, what you have is that there are about 14 differences that exist between Torah scrolls from Yemen, for example, and Torah scrolls that come from certain parts of Europe. And that includes also Torah scrolls that come from Iraq and things like that. Now, when you say 14, differences, one of the things that has to be understood is that when I'm saying 14 differences, I'm talking out of a difference of about 300,000 words, for example, I believe it is, or 300,000 letters, I think. Essentially, what you're looking at is about 14 differences between scrolls. But the interesting thing is that none of those differences change the meaning of words. They don't change the meaning of the text. The vast majority of those differences are the same letter in both scrolls, but that in one scroll, the letter is bigger than it is in the other one, for like a reason, for example. Where in another text, there's a word that's like a letter that's like a helper letter, for example, where in the word honor in English, for example, there's some ways you can write it where it's Honor, and there's some ways you can write honor where it's Honour. And that's about the level of the difference, where there's a helper letter called a waw that's either there or added there in written form, where in the other text where it's not there in written form, it's actually pronounced the same way. It's just it doesn't have to be there. There's about 2 letters in the Hebrew language which is Yud and also Waw, that have the same situation where if they were written there, that's one thing. But if they're not written there, it can still be pronounced without it being there. They're like helper letters. And there's only like one word that has like a spacing difference. And there's one word, for example, that has like it's 2 different words, but dakal and dokal. But the difference between them is only in the last letter, which is either aleph or hey. And one word simply means, they both mean the same thing, but just one is more of a more extreme version of the other word. And those are like the differences. So you would expect after thousands of years of separation, of more than 2,000 years, 2,500 years of certain communities not having any contact with each other, you'd expect when they come back to Israel, you'd have completely different texts. You'd have like almost thousands of differences, in the Torah text. And that's something that you just don't have. You have a situation where the scribes who were transcribing this and copying it were using the same rules that were established more than 2,500 years ago across the board, and we're copying it in the same process of checking it over and over again and reviewing the text over and over again, and basically having it where the regular average Jew in many of these communities could check it and see, okay, something's not right here, if something were wrong with it. That kept those checks and balances going, and the fact that there have been Jewish communities in existence for more than 2,500 years in different areas outside of the land of Israel also shows up this point. So in order to kind of graphically understand this better, what you see here is something I presented in a previous video, where the top text is from a Sefer Torah, meaning that the Torah scroll that can be used in an official setting. Where the bottom text is a Masoretic text, which means it has vowels and punctuation added to it. Essentially, someone took a Torah scroll, sat down with it, and then from there copied it and made a text with vowels and punctuation, where Torah scroll doesn't have vowels and punctuation added to it. People read it based upon memory of like where the context is and where the vowels and punctuation are supposed to go, and it's chanted by memory in that way. Now, what's interesting though is that this is what I presented in a previous video for Genesis 1 through 2. So one of the challenges that people sometimes bring up is the Dead Sea Scrolls. That people say, well, the Dead Sea Scrolls are more than 2,000, about 200 years old in some cases, and they say, oh, there's huge differences between them. But then when you actually ask, someone in Hebrew, okay, what are the differences? What you'll find is that there really aren't any differences that are there, especially like the ones that do exist are like very negligible. And again, if you look at this example of a Dead Sea Scroll, this is another example of what I showed you earlier. I can look at this scroll right here, and I can actually read what I see there. So for example, I see that there's a gap in the first part of it, where normally there would be what's called Bereshit would be there. And the next word over that I see is Elohim, Et Hashemayim Ve'et Haaretz. Now I can know that the text would continue on to the left, but there's a big gap there, and it looks like a piece is missing. But then I notice in the next line, there says Ruach Elohim Merachafet Al Pnei Hamoim. And then I know there's another gap, and then there's Maim Et Haor Ki Kitov V'Davar. So it's kind of hard to see there. Ve'ele. Then the next line I see is Vayikro Elohim Leor Hoshech. So again, it's a little hard for me to read, and it says Yom Echad. So there's areas there where it's like a little hard to read depending on like how the scribe wrote it, but I can generally speaking read it. And if I sat down with like a mnemonic, I could be able to say, okay, well, there's certain letters here that they write a little bit differently, at least back then in this text they did, but I still know which one's which. So comparing this, essentially, this is the top one, of course, is the Sefer Torah that I was showing you earlier. The bottom one is the Dead Sea Scroll. Now, again, if there was just such a big difference, you would expect that there would be huge differences where just you can't even understand what's being read here. But essentially, here is what we see is the same thing. Elohim et Hashemayim ve'et haaretz. Okay, and that's the same for both of them. Now, again, what I mentioned before was that there were gaps in the text. So, for example, the beginning of the text, Bereshit Borah, is obviously, it's there somewhere, but again, it looks like there's a hole in the text. There's like a hole that happened at some point because of time, because of wear and tear and whatever. So then the next thing we see is Ruach Elohim Merachafet Al Pnei Hamoim. So that's also common in the Dead Sea Scroll text. And then you can keep going on, and what we find is that basically if you read through the fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, you'll find the same exact thing. Now, here is a more complete comparison of one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is on the right side. It's like a transcription of it into Hebrew, to modern Hebrew. And essentially, it's just like, taking the same letters and copying them in the way we write them now. So that's legible. And then to the left is a regular Masoretic text, or a Sefer Torah text. And essentially what I've put in the boxes there are the differences between the two. Now, what you'll notice on the right side at the top, there's a box over the word Elohim. And if you go straight across to the left, you'll see the word Elohim. But the difference is that there's the wall on the Dead Sea Scroll text is included, where the wall is understood in the left side of the Masoretic text / Sefer Torah text. And this continues throughout the text. Every place where you see me having red boxes there is a place where the wall is either added in the Dead Sea Scroll part, and it's understood in the left side of the Masorah. So in the Masorah, I would read the word, for example, in the I guess you could say the second group of boxes, as both sides, I would read them as la. So wala, wala, wala. So it doesn't change the fact that somebody added a wall in the Dead Sea Scroll one. It just tells me that the Dead Sea Scroll one was a Chumash. It wasn't a Sefer Torah that was used for official use, because they added a wall because of the fact that without there being any vowel points at that time, they wanted to make sure the person reading it would understand that the word is lo. So, basically with the Sefer Torah, it's understood. And the same continues. And there was a word poged and poged, and essentially in the same thing, it's added a wall there. Now, if you go a little bit further, what you find that's interesting is in the Dead Sea Scroll one, they have a word that's a little bit lower to the bottom, where they add the word zachorto. Whoever the scribe was added a hey at the end of zachorto. Now, the thing that's interesting about that is that's not something that you usually find in the Hebrew language. I mean, the word zachorto basically means like you will remember in this text, and it also can be like past tense, you will remember, or you remembered. But in this case, it's like you will zachorto, you will remember. But the scribe of the Dead Sea Scroll added a hey at the end, and the way I can understand it is he added the hey at the end to try to facilitate the understanding that the word is not zachart, but instead zacharto. So he added the hey to for someone who didn't understand that this would be zacharto, not zachart. What zachart means, like to a woman, you remembered, or you will remember. What zacharto means to a man, you will remember, or you remember. So that's where I could see that the scribe did that, to add that. Now, also, one thing that did happen was the scribe added a little bit more verbiage to this particular passage, because the passage is talking about the Shabbat, the Sabbath. But again, the verbiage that they added just comes from another part of the Torah. So again, this is not something where I look and say, oh, this is completely a different text. The differences are so huge, it's just you can't even overcome them. No, it's just someone adding, if you will, commentary to their text. And again, we don't have any evidence that the Dead Sea Scrolls were ever considered to be a text that was used officially in the synagogue, which is simply a personal text that somebody was using. And in a personal text, it could be that someone sat down and added their own commentary into the text so that they can understand the text for themselves, where an official text, it wouldn't be used, for example. So in conclusion, the process of creating a Sefer Torah text is complex, and it's one that's been recorded and has existed prior to more than 2,500 years ago in ancient Jewish communities, and it's something that's even proven out by the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what's important to note is that much of what people say about the Dead Sea Scrolls being different often comes up in the non-Torah-based text, for example. So it could be that, like, let's say in the Book of Kings, there's a little difference here and there, but that's perfectly fine, because those weren't like texts that were considered to be like a Torah scroll. Where the Torah scroll came from Hashem, the text of other writings in the Tanakh, were either inspired by Hashem, like meaning that he spoke to a Navi, a prophet, and a prophet just simply wrote it down later on. Where the Torah was actually commanded by Hashem to tell Moshe Rabbeinu exactly what to write, how to write it, how to space it, and things like that. The next step also is to understand that the Dead Sea Scrolls don't provide any differences between what is used in Jewish communities today, either in a Torah scroll or a Masoretic text, for example, which Masoretic only means that they added vowels and punctuation. It doesn't mean anything else besides that. And essentially what that means is that the Jewish communities around the world that are ancient have been preserving this tradition, which is proven out to be more than about 2,500 years old. But, according to Jewish tradition, goes back to the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe ben Amram. So that's one of the ways that a person has to understand what exactly the Torah text is and what it takes to produce one. So this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. Thank you for listening. Take care. Bye.